All right, so good evening. Welcome to this class. Let's start with a few prayers. This was very kindly put together by Chris Caldetroni. So this is how we're going to start tonight, is reciting the praise to the Buddha that's on the left-hand side of the screen there. And then we'll recite that 3 times together in English. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings tamed, teach gods and human beings, you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Now let's do the short mandala offering. Let's just do this single verse that's there in English as it's stated, and the offering mantra, Idam Guru, and so on. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I'm then taking refuge in generating bodhicitta before the teaching. We'll do that once in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I did notice one error just now. The third line should simply say, by the merit I create by listening to the Dharma. Then the next line, may I become a Buddha. So leave off that other part. There's 2 different versions of the refuge prayer, and they've got both of them in that one line. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chunyen Gipe Sonam Gi Drola Pendir Sangye Drupar Shog. So I have to change that third line of the Tibetan to Chunyen instead of Chengi. Anyway, I'm not sure where that came from. Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chunyen Gipe Sonam Gi Drola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shog. Okay. So let's go ahead then and do a short meditation before we begin the class tonight. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit, to generate a good motivation. I think I'm going to turn this light to there. Well, maybe there's fine. Okay. I wasn't sure how much light. It looks a little bit bright from here, but so let's just do a short meditation to begin with. Find a good meditation posture and do a few minutes of focused meditation on the breath. And then after that, I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation for being here. So I'll ring the chime to begin the meditation period. So now let's generate our motivation for tonight's class. And we've been exploring in this course the wisdom of emptiness and coming to understand this middle way, this path between these two extremes, the extreme that we and other beings have been bound up in, where we continue to reify things, continue to adhere to this truly existent self, and live from this vantage point of ignorance, and thereby create the causes for our own suffering, our own cycling in existence, our own unenlightened state. And then, of course, the other precipice, the other extreme that we are trying to assure that we avoid is the extreme of nihilism, thinking that somehow things don't exist, that things aren't relevant, that karma isn't effective, and so on. So we have to find, this perfect middle way between these two extremes. This is the intention of this class, is to help us to truly discover the middle way. And the initial motivation for engaging in this class tonight can be one's own welfare initially. Certainly good to start at that point, to recognize that if we are ever to achieve freedom from our own cycle of suffering, of dukkha, going from life to life, never knowing any real peace or satisfaction, we have to cultivate this wisdom. We have to find the middle way. But because countless other beings are in the same predicament, we need to go beyond just that self-centered motivation, that desire for our own freedom, our own liberation. We need to expand upon that and to think that we're going to achieve a state of greatest, highest enlightenment, the state whereby we will then not only be free from our own suffering, but we will be in the best position to benefit all sentient beings. So especially as we look upon the world these days and see the great suffering that exists, suffering that has been going on since beginningless time for all these countless beings, our heart should be moved to want to do something meaningful with this life, especially with this time, so that we can help others. So cultivate that motivation of bodhicitta very strongly, so that everything we do tonight becomes a part of achieving that result. Okay, so again, we're working in this course on Nagarjuna's text. It's often just abbreviated as Fundamental Wisdom. Okay, great. We see a problem with an echo there from someone's speaker. So I think that's resolved now. So again, what we're doing in this course is we're going through 3 chapters of Nagarjuna's text, and we've already done 2 of them, and we're kind of not quite midway, but close to midway through the 3rd one. The very first chapter we went to was jumping way ahead in the text, chapter 26. Chapter 26 of the 27 chapters, it's the one that deals with the 12 links of dependent arising, how we are going from life to life, cycling from existence to existence, primarily driven by our ignorance, by our misunderstanding of reality, not having found that middle way, clinging tightly to inherent existence. So in order to achieve liberation from the wheel of psychic existence, we need to understand emptiness. Emptiness was the main subject of the 18th chapter. That was the second one we worked with, where we were looking at particularly the emptiness of the self, the emptiness of the person, this I that we cling to so tightly, that we think exists truly, inherently, substantially, in reality, but it doesn't have that level of existence at all. Having examined then the conventional way that we are cycling in existence, the ultimate knowledge or truth that we have to generate in order to be free from that, we now are in the 3rd chapter that we're looking at, which is chapter 24, where the Nagarjuna kind of pulls together the teachings of the Four Noble Truths and shows how the Four Noble Truths, although we had some objectors at the very beginning of this chapter saying, oh, well, it's impossible if you subscribe to the type of emptiness that you're preaching, if you subscribe to the type of emptiness that means the lack of any inherent existence, well, then everything is going to be destroyed by virtue of that. The Four Noble Truths won't exist. The 3 jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, won't exist, and so on. So we had this objector at the very beginning of chapter 24, spelling out how, in their estimation, we were in a nihilistic view. But of course, this is not how Nagarjuna presents the middle way. It doesn't, teeter into nihilism at all. It is that middle way between these two extremes, as I mentioned in the motivation. So we went through a whole section. Let me go ahead and go to slides. I have prepared some slides because I thought it might be a little bit better for tonight when we're online to have these slides. I have to get the slideshow up just a second. So the objection was raised in the first, and again, they were verses that essentially were pointing out from the point of view of this imaginary objector that all of these things that the Buddha propounds don't exist in the face of this view of emptiness. Verse 1, for example, if all of this is empty, neither arising nor disintegrating, then for you it follows that the Four Noble Truths do not exist. Of course, this is somebody who's a made-up opponent who is pointing at the Nagarjuna and the madhyamikas and saying, you have all fallen into nihilism. We've been working on the reply, and we're almost done with the reply in terms of the this whole section that works with Nagarjuna's way of refuting that problem exists for us. We don't have that problem. These things can be completely reconciled by virtue of the teachings on the two truths. The ultimate truth that is the wisdom of emptiness, but also conventional truth that things do still have a mode of existing. They still do exist. Karma exists. The Four Noble Truths exist. Rebirth exists. All of this exists, but not in the way that we think it does. That's what the teaching on emptiness is to help us to achieve, is the undermining and removing of that ignorance that thinks that things exist in that concrete, real way. It had two outlines. The first outline we concluded last week when we met at the center. That outline was showing that the opponent's argument is advanced without understanding the way dependent origination is in reality. Kind of understanding, again, that emptiness is one side of the equation, but dependent origination is the other. And that these two actually are completely complementary, as we've been discussing in the last few classes. So with that, we went all the way up in the last class through verse 17. Which was kind of when we started throwing back at the opponent that they're actually making the fault, that they're the ones that have the fault of creating a nihilistic view, because if they think things exist in essentially or intrinsically, inherently, then nothing can exist, because such a thing can't exist in a world of dependent origination. Particularly, again, focusing on this idea that things arise from their causes and conditions. Everything that is produced depends upon causes and conditions. That fact alone, even though that's not the subtlest way that we even understand dependent arising in this tradition, that fact alone means that things can't have some sort of separate, concrete, independent existence because they rely upon those factors. So this is what we discussed up through the last class. Tonight, the second part of the reply, which is the presentation of our own explanation of emptiness as the meaning of dependent origination. So this is, we started this last week with verse 18. We read that verse, and then we went on and talked about one sutra recitation or sutra citation that was made in regard to this in Lama Tsongkhapa's text. So let's read this verse again. You can just read it on your own as I read it. Verse 18. Whatever is dependently originated, that is explained to be emptiness. That, being a dependent designation, is itself the middle way. So this whole idea of, again, how we are able to find this middle way when we understand dependent arising, when we get the fact that things come into existence in dependence upon various factors. So let me pause this for just a moment so I can come back and do one more recap of these three levels of dependent origination. I just talked about the very first one. And again, all the Buddhist schools would say that things do arise in dependence upon their causes and conditions. If they're produced, such as, a cup or a table or a person, a body, a mind, all these produce phenomena, they arise from their causes and conditions. But the lower schools don't get the fact that if that's so, if something that is produced depends upon its causes and conditions, it can't exist inherently. And all the lower schools will say, no, things do exist inherently, and they do arise from their causes and conditions. The way that these two are set out is contradictory, whereas the emptiness of inherent existence and things arising from their causes and conditions are complementary. They're totally in line with each other. So this is, again, the first level of dependent arising, is that those things that are produced arise in dependence upon their causes and conditions. The second level is that everything that exists, not those things that are permanent, unchanging, as well as those things that are impermanent that arise from causes and conditions, all phenomena depend upon their parts, be they sort of temporal parts, spatial parts, whatever types of parts. Those parts and the whole, that is kind of the relationship between those, is always one of dependence. You can't have a whole without the parts. And of course the parts, together constitute a whole. So you have this, relationship that is set out here in regard to that second level of dependent origination. The third level is where we start looking at those parts from the viewpoint of being the basis for designation, the basis for imputation. And here the idea is that all phenomena that exist rely upon a conceptual mind designating them, labeling them. So the only way that we can say that there is something called cup, this little cute cup that somebody gave me way back many, many years ago, a Laura Birch, I think Lauren Birch, I can't remember her name. Anyway, the only way that we can talk about cup and kind of have an existence of cup is by labeling the idea of cup to what's in my hand. And what's in my hand is actually the basis for cup. There is no real cup in my hand, because if it was a real cup, it would be established as cup from its own side. Instead, everything that exists depends upon being labeled, a consciousness that is giving some designation to it. That's why we designate things lamps and computers and phones and whatever the case might be. All these phenomena having a basis, a suitable basis, something that we will all agree that we're going to designate it as such, but then the designating consciousness that gives it its identity. It doesn't have any self-identity. It's not self-established. So again, even at that first level, as Nagarjuna is pointing out, of seeing that things depend upon causes and conditions, already contradicts them having any essential or intrinsic existence, because that dependency is indicative of them not being able to stand on their own, not being able to set themselves up. And when we think about what goes on in nature in terms of things transforming, again, I've used this example before because Master Chandrakirti uses this in his supplement to the Middle Way, is the idea of a seed giving rise to a sprout. So when we look at the process, and many of you did this when you were in grade school, right, where you had maybe even like a piece of corn or something that you put into a little glass jar, and you watched as it went up and became like a sprout and came up out of the ground and what have you. But we see that there's this whole changing process that goes on. Kind of what happens to the seed when the sprout exists? Where is the continuity of that? Where is its ability to stand on its own as seed or sprout? It becomes very kind of challenging in that regard. It shows us that there is actually just a continuation of process that's going on, and we're simply designating labels to various stages along the way. So this is what we're doing with everything in our world. Nothing exists as what we call it from its own side. It doesn't have its bookness or cupness or tableness or chairness. It is rather us giving and attributing those qualities to it. There are, again, an agreement that we're going to call things by these various labels in our culture so that we can communicate with each other. But there's nothing from the side of the object that makes it what it is. So back to the text then, and I'll do a little bit more in regard to that verse, because we did, as I said, last week we shared the very first of these quotes from Sutra. But let me read initially what Tsongkhapa says. I did read this well. In Ocean of Thing, page 504, he says, the reason, according to our system, this whole ontology is tenable, that we can find ways for things to come into existence, is that we maintain that emptiness of being essentially arisen is explained to refer to that which is arisen in dependence on causes and conditions. So this is that whole idea that we're equating emptiness, the lack of any independent, inherent existence, with dependent arising, dependent origination. And even at the level of depending upon causes and conditions, it is equally valid, that you can show that because things depend upon their causes and conditions, they can't have an independent existence. They have to be empty of that. So the question was raised then as part of Tsongkhapa's commentary, where has it been explained like that? The very first of the citations that we went through last week was from the Anavattapta Sutra, which says, whatever is arisen from conditions is unarisen. It does not have the essence of arising. So the very first part of it, and I'll go through what Tsongkhapa says again, but that first arisen, whatever is arisen from conditions, means things that arise conventionally from causes and conditions. The cup, the pot, the table, the whatever, everything that we have in this world that is a produced phenomenon arises from its conditions conventionally. Therefore, those things are unarisen, meaning that they don't arise inherently, essentially, intrinsically. They don't have the ability to do that because they're arising depending upon their causes and conditions. And then that last second line, it does not have the essence of arising. Well, it does arise conventionally, but the essence of arising, meaning it doesn't have essential arising, meaning it doesn't have inherent arising. Things cannot arise inherently because no such thing is possible. Things arise in dependence upon other factors. So this is what Tsongkhapa then says in his commentary. He says, of these citations from Sutra, the first one refutes their being essentially arisen by arguing that because they have arisen from conditions, they are therefore dependently originated, and says that the very meaning of depending on conditions is the meaning of empty of essential existence. So this is something that's going to be a part of this verse and the next one, is that we are equating those two. If something depends upon conditions, it has to be empty of essential or independent existence. It would be contradictory if we had them both, having essential existence and having dependence upon conditions. They couldn't possibly be both posited. They're opposite ways of being, ontological opposites. This statement refutes the assertion that being a dependently originated phenomenon that arises and ceases in dependence upon causes and conditions entails existing essentially. Once more, the lower schools are all adhering to this. They think that because things have their causes and conditions, they must have something within them that makes them what they are. They want to hold to intrinsic, essential, inherent, independent existence while holding to things still depending upon causes and conditions. And in the madhyamika view, in this perfect middle way that we're aiming for, this is impossible. If something is dependent upon causes and conditions, it lacks any independent existence. So that was the, well, there's actually one other line on this, I'm sorry, a little bit more on the commentary. It also refutes those views according to which no agent or action is possible in the context of essencelessness. This is because this has eloquently distinguished between being non-arisen and lacking essential arising. So that non-arisen in that last sentence are, being non-arisen, not arising at all, and lacking essential arising. There is a difference between these two. There are things that the Buddha says don't exist, inherent existence being one of them. Those things that are non-arisen, that don't come into existence, that's not what the Buddha is saying in terms of lacking essential arising. He's not saying that that means that things don't arise at all. In fact, he's saying once more just the opposite. He's saying that because things lack any essential arising, any intrinsic arising, therefore they arise dependently, and vice versa. Because they arise dependently, depending upon their causes and conditions, therefore they lack any essential arising, any independent arising. So this is the first quote that we went through last week. And I'm again kind of taking quotes, and I'm the quotes with the commentary. It's not how it's set out in the text. On page 503, there's the Lankavatara Sutra, where the Buddha said, "O men of great intelligence, having in mind that which is essentially non-arisen, I have explained that all phenomena are non-arisen." So the commentary that Tsongkhapa has on this is, he says in the second citation from Sutra, the teacher interprets his own intention. The Buddha says that the statements that he has made, that things are not arisen, are made with the fact in mind that they are not essentially arisen. So let's go back to that verse. So again, having in mind that which is essentially non-arisen, that's how he explains that phenomena are non-arisen. He's not saying that things don't arise at all, which is again a consequence that the opponent is trying to throw on us. Rather, the idea is that things don't have any essential arising. therefore they don't arise that way, but they do still arise. We're not negating mere arising. We're not negating that things come into existence. The Buddha never negated any such thing. In fact, his intention is that when he says that things are non-arisen, he means essentially non-arisen, inherently non-arisen, intrinsically non-arisen. So to conclude that, he says, therefore, this that one should take the meaning of the refutations in sutra of things being arisen, not to be that they are not arisen at all, but instead to be that they are not essentially arisen. So anytime we see in sutra where the Buddha refutes that things are arisen, he says, that too is not arisen. It doesn't mean that they're not arisen at all, as Tsongkhapa says, but rather that they are not essentially arisen. The Buddha didn't always add that little qualifier to it, but that's how he meant it. That's the definitive meaning of those passages, is to find exactly what the Buddha's intention was. The third sutra citation, which again is on page 504 then of Ocean of Reasoning, is from the Vadyarda Satika Sutra. Says, all phenomena are empty. That is, in virtue of being essenceless. So this is how the Buddha is defining empty. In his teachings, he doesn't mean empty of functioning. He doesn't mean empty of any other kind of thing that people could make up around it, empty of just mere existence. Rather, he means empty in virtue of being essenceless. And by that we mean not having its inherent existence, its inherent establishment. Things cannot be established from their own side. They arise in dependence upon their causes and conditions. They arise in dependence upon their parts, in dependence upon that designation, that imputation by a consciousness. But things cannot have their own essence. They would be a total fault to say that people, or to say that things have their own essence, and to hold that emptiness means something else, empty of mere existence, for example. So the Tsongkhapa says on this, the third citation from Sutra demonstrates the difference between non-existence and essencelessness by saying that the meaning of emptiness is emptiness of essence, that is essencelessness. It's not, again, empty of existing at all. It's empty of having an inherent, intrinsic, essential existence. That emptiness that is essencelessness is posited as a dependent origination, just like the chariot, which is designated on its parts, is empty. That is, it's not essentially arisen. So the Buddha did use like the chariot, and Master Chandrakirti in his text I mentioned earlier uses the chariot as a good example of where we can pick things apart. Nowadays we don't have chariots though, right? So we can do that with regard to a car. Maybe I'll take it off screen there for just a second. So when we talk about what we mean by a car, and you can think about your own vehicle, whether you call it a car or a truck or whatever the case might be, your vehicle, it seems to have its entity, which is its carness or truckness that completely covers the entire set of parts. And we even think about things being parts of a car, as if there's something that is a car that is the whole, that these are all parts of, in a really intrinsic way, that the car has some sort of substantial entity there, identity there, that is not really depending upon the parts, but is rather established from its own side. But if we go and investigate, just like we did with the self, when we've talked about the self in chapter 18, we don't find that there is a car that can be found to be identical to any of the parts, or even the sum of the parts. We also don't find it to be completely different from the parts. It's not like I say, oh, my car's over there when the parts of my car are over there. Rather, we see that these two, again, have a different relationship, car being the designation to the parts of a car, which are the basis for that designation. And it arising on the basis of all of its causes and conditions means it also can't have any inherent existence. But especially when we come to understand how these things that we designate are simply a label we give to that. There's nothing intrinsically, inherently established from the side of the basis that identifies it as car. I mean, if we go through the parts of a car, can you find one part in regard to the entire parts of the car that is the essence of the car, that is its intrinsic identity as car? No, and we can, even if we again lump them all together, well, the fact that you're lumping them all together, making them into this complex phenomenon that has many different parts to it, indicates that there has to be many different cards there. There's not one part there. There's many, many parts that are put together, assembled, so that you can have what we call a car. So again, this is the way that Buddha talked about this was to show that, again, he's talking about emptiness of essence, that you can't find anything intrinsically there. Rather, you find that things exist on the basis of a variety of relationships, their dependency upon causes and conditions, dependency upon their parts, and dependency upon mere imputation. So we'll go back to what Tsongkhapa says, continuing this. He says, emptiness, that is the absence of essential arising, is free from the two extremes. Therefore, it is the middle and is the middle path. That is where the madhyamikas fare. So one second, I think we do have to get someone's microphone. Yeah, I've got that muted now, sorry. Okay, let me reduce that again. So what's being said by Tsongkhapa here is that emptiness, this absence of essential arising, is free from the two extremes I explained earlier. It's not falling into the extreme that we're in currently with regard to our reification of things, thinking that things exist intrinsically, inherently, truly, substantially, essentially. Rather, and it's also free from the extreme of nihilism, of kind of denying that things exist at all. So this emptiness that is taught by the Buddha is the middle way. It's the middle and is the middle path. That is where the madhyamikas, those who are middle way proponents, fare, where we like to hang out, is in that middle between these two extremes, having negated either of them as being possibilities. That things exist inherently is impossible, that things don't exist at all is impossible. Rather, we can uphold their existence in the space of acknowledging their lack of inherent or essential existence. So we have a nice little verse that Tsongkhapa quotes. It says similarly, it says in the Vigraha Vartani, I'm really bad at pronouncing all these Sanskrit sutra names, that these three are synonyms: emptiness, dependent arising, and the middle way. So this is the verse from that. It says, I prostrate to the Buddha who is unparalleled and who has given the supreme teaching that emptiness, dependent origination, and the middle path have the same meaning. That if we really identify clearly what we mean by emptiness, we see the subtlest way that there exists dependent arising, dependent origination. We are in the middle way by virtue of that. We have found that true path between these two extremes that will help us to avoid either one of them. Help us to avoid the nihilism that could lead us to having unfavorable consequences because we continue to create lots more problems for ourselves by not having found that correct view, or the other extreme, where we fall into the extreme of continuing to reify things so that we just exacerbate our own suffering by that things exist intrinsically. Now we go on to verse 19, which is still within this section. There's not a change in outline headings, but Tsongkhapa had taken a fair amount of time to go through some things. But before I go to 19, I actually did want to share a little bit more. I didn't do slides for all of what Tsongkhapa had in his Ocean of Reasoning, and that's because I felt like it was just maybe too much to try to put on screen. It was quite a few, almost a full page. But he puts forward an argument. He says, suppose someone argued as follows. What is the meaning of the many statements that the meaning of emptiness, of essential existence, is the meaning of dependent origination? Because if we look at these, we kind of say, well, the meaning of emptiness is an ultimate truth. Dependent origination is a conventional truth. Are you saying that an ultimate truth is the meaning, or the conventional truth is the meaning of an ultimate truth, or even vice versa? I mean, how can these two have that relationship of one meaning being the meaning of the other? So he uses this opponent uses a few more questions to put forward what his objection is. He says, if its meaning is like that of that which is bulbous, is posited as the meaning of pot. So the word pot, that signifies a bowl that we use to hold things. That which is flat and bulbous is how that is defined. So are we saying that in the same way that pot has that which is flat and bulbous as its meaning, that is the way that we're talking about here? Because he says, then, when one ascertains through a particular cognitive process that effects have arisen from causes, in other words, the dependent or origination side of it, one should thereby ascertain through that same cognitive process the meaning of emptiness. But this does not make sense, you know. And if we really think about it once more, we have all of these proponents of Buddhist tenets who are saying, yes, things exist in dependence upon their causes and conditions, but they haven't posited emptiness by virtue of that. They haven't, by understanding the meaning of things arising in dependence upon their causes and conditions, they haven't been able to posit emptiness. So you can't mean that that's the actual meaning of it, that if you looked up emptiness in the dictionary, it would say, you know, that things depend upon their causes and conditions, or that there is dependent origination. So we're not, you know, he's putting forward that that can't possibly be the meaning. He says you cannot escape from this problem, even if you say that the meaning of the expression that refers to dependent arising is itself the meaning of emptiness. It is also not tenable, as was explained earlier, to maintain that emptiness is the indirect object of a direct ascertainment of dependent arising. Because otherwise, once more, if we were realizing that dependent arising, we would get emptiness immediately. We would have some sort of inferential knowledge of emptiness simply when we're understanding that things depend upon their causes and conditions. But again, most beings in the world have great confidence in the law of cause and effect and in terms of the world and how it arises. You know, and they know how to, worldly people know how to produce things in the world by virtue of that knowledge. So again, we can't mean that it's the same, because if they're getting an understanding of how things arise in dependence upon their causes and conditions, they should be getting an understanding of emptiness along the way, but they're not. So the reply that's given by Tsongkhapa, this is on the bottom of page 504, he says, but we do not maintain any of that. Then what do we maintain? To take the meaning of emptiness as dependent origination is only for those madhyamikas who have, through authoritative cognition, refuted things having essential existence, but not for others. In other words, this is a realization that one can speak to when one has come full circle. I've spoken about this a number of times in this course, right? That we can certainly know and be valid with regard to conventional existence, all the things that are dependent arising that we relate to. But that doesn't mean, again, that we've fully understood how those actually exist. We have to go through a process of realizing their ultimate truth, their emptiness, to come back around and see the subtle way in which things are dependent upon all their factors, especially they're being merely designated, imputed by a consciousness, by a conceptual mind. So the idea here is that it's not just anybody who we would say, oh, you know, you want to understand emptiness, its meaning is dependent origination, that things arise in dependence upon their causes and conditions. Some people may be able to work with that and get it over time, because it is a very powerful reasoning to get there. But just saying that somebody understands that things have causes and conditions and depend upon them doesn't mean that they're actually having that wisdom that understands emptiness in the light of that, that they are seeing that those two are these two factors inextricably bound up in how all things exist. So he says, when these madhyamikas ascertain that internal and external things are dependently arisen in virtue of their dependence on causes, as a consequence of that very cognitive process, they ascertain the emptiness of essential existence. The madhyamikas can use an understanding of how things depend upon causes and conditions as the very mode by which they come to understand emptiness and see them, again, as totally complementary. Whereas most beings won't have the ability to do that. It's only those madhyamikas who are trained, who have, as it was said here, through authoritative cognition, which again, I don't have the Tibetan, so I couldn't tell you what the word is. It's being translated as authoritative, but it must mean close to what we often call valid cognition, having a valid cognition of emptiness. When they have that, then they can become kind of reliable sources in regard to truly understanding the ramifications of dependent arising, things depending upon their causes and conditions and so on. The last sentence on this page, essential existence is realized to be independence of others. And that and dependent origination are realized by authoritative cognition to be inconsistent. So when we come to see that what we mean by essential or intrinsic or substantial or, you know, objective existence is independent existence. You know, I've used this, you know, way of approaching it a number of times, right? If we really see that what we are refuting What we are adhering to now that we want to refute completely is that things exist independently. Well, then independent existence and dependent arising are totally contradictory. Any logical mind can see that, you know. For example, if we use permanent and impermanent, and in that context, when we use it in Buddhism, permanent means that which is not changing moment by moment, impermanent, that which is changing moment by moment. We see that those are contradictory. They're inconsistent. You can't have something, we couldn't establish that everything is permanent and still establish that there are impermanent phenomena in the world, because it wouldn't work out. You'd be refuting things that are directly contradictory to that we can see through our valid cognition exist. So in this way too, when we look at how things depend upon their causes and conditions, upon their parts, upon mere designation, we come to understand that they cannot have any independent existence then. Essential existence is independent existence. It is an ability to stand on its own without any other factors being involved. So this is all that Tsongkhapa is reiterating. And he continues at the top of the next page, and he, says, therefore, the person who has cultivated the ascertainment of emptiness, which is the negation of essential existence through dependent origination, having seen, heard, and remembered that such things as barley and sprouts are dependent on causes and conditions, should then practice the contemplation of the fact that they are essenceless for that very reason. So when we begin to see that their dependency is a good reasoning for us to understand their lack of independent existence. Again, it all makes sense when we put it in these words. It's just our minds are so stuck in all of our grasping at things as inherently, truly, independently existing that it's contrary to how we actually experience the world. Anyway, I'm not going to read all the rest of this. Again, I had read the last part of this. For some reason, I had skipped over that when I was doing my presentation tonight of that with the slides. But know that this kind of concludes with that idea that emptiness of essence, what we're talking about here is the inherent existence and so on, that emptiness, dependent origination, and the middle way are identical. They're all driving to the same truth. That is this ability to not continue to fall into the extreme of existence, eternalism, where we're holding the thing so tightly to exist independently, nor to completely remove any level of existence and to fall into a nihilistic bent. So that's the idea behind that section. So again, verse 19 is still in the same outline heading. And it's also a very famous verse. I mentioned that both 18 and 19 were on a little sheet that Charmaine said she'd gotten from at his teachings with His Holiness. And His Holiness had really recommended that they meditate on these verses, and I'm going to encourage you to do the same. So verse 18 that we saw previously, again, was that idea that whatever is dependently originated, that is explained to be emptiness. That being a dependent designation is itself the middle way. Verse 19 continues with that idea, saying that which is not dependently originated, such a thing doesn't exist. Therefore, that which is not empty, such a thing doesn't exist. So this is kind of looking at it from the reverse, the negative, and saying we cannot find anything that isn't dependently originated. Even emptiness itself is dependently originated, dependence upon our mere designation of that quality of emptiness, that lack of inherent existence. So everything is merely imputed by thought. It always depends upon some other factor for its existence, even the truth of emptiness. So such a thing that is not dependently originated, no way does it exist. Therefore, everything is empty, because that which is not empty, such a thing doesn't exist. Everything has to be empty, because everything is a dependent arising, because these two once more are equivalent. So let's look at what Tsongkhapa says in regard to his commentary on that. This is page 505, and I think I've included all the commentary here because it's not very long. He says, therefore, since there is nothing that is not dependently arisen, and since dependently originated phenomena are all empty of essential existence, there are no phenomena that are not empty of essential existence. So again, there's nothing that's completely independent, that's not dependently arising. And since dependently originated phenomena are empty of essential existence. They can't have that because they depend on other factors. Therefore, there are no phenomena that are empty, that are not empty of essential existence. Everything is empty of essential existence. And then he does another sutra quote to back this up. According to the Untitled Sutra that was quoted earlier, wise, having understood dependently originated phenomena, do not rely on extreme views. They don't fall into nihilistic or eternalistic views. They understand that phenomena have causes and conditions, and that no phenomena exist without causes and conditions. Of course, this is within the realm of conditioned phenomena, produced phenomena, but essentially everything that has causes and conditions can't exist without those causes and conditions. That by its very fact means that everything is dependently originated and therefore empty of intrinsic existence, empty of independent existence. So they won't rely on extreme views. They won't fall into those extreme views if you stick to that middle way. This is why, once more, dependent arising is said to be the reasoning that is the king of reasonings. The king, because it will allow us to keep that middle way very much in mind as we pursue our understanding of emptiness. We never negate that phenomena exist at all, because all we do is talk about what they depend upon for their arising, for their existence. That concludes the second section. Again, we had, that was B, which was, I don't have it right in front of me. Oh, I do have it right here in regard to the outlines. Outline B was this idea of the reply, again, that we had divided into two parts, that the opponent's argument was advanced without understanding the way dependent origination is, and then also that their argument rests on not understanding the two truths. So this is what we've just gone through and completed, is that things, I'm not sorry, that's not the two truths. This was, sorry, that presentation of our own explanation of emptiness as the meaning of dependent origination. Anyway, those are not so important. Those are the two outlines that were under B. That concludes B. That's the second of 4 parts to this chapter. Now we go into C. C has quite a few verses. It's got about 20 verses. And it's essentially why, for those who do not accept this, no ontological framework is tenable. So essentially what's going to happen in this section is that Tsongkhapa is going to, and Nagarjuna initially, of course, and Tsongkhapa in explaining it, is going to go back and say, hey, if you actually don't hold to emptiness, then you will have the problem of, once more, none of these things making sense. So it's a bit of like an extension of what we saw earlier in terms of Nagarjuna saying, well, the errors that you're trying to put on us are actually errors that belong to you, like we saw last week when we talked about the analogy of the person who's counting all their horses, but they're on a horse while they're counting them, and they forget to count that one and think someone has stolen one of their horses. Well, that's because it's a similar analogy, because they are guilty of the fault that they're accusing other people of, because they are actually the ones that are not seeing the horse that they've sort of stolen or that they're on. By virtue of that, they're miscounting the horses in their herd. So anyway, this is divided into 6 outlines, verses 20 through 39 of chapter 24. The very first outline, the Four Noble Truths as objects of knowledge, will make no sense. We can't posit the Four Noble Truths in the space of somebody not positing emptiness, not positing lack of inherent existence, and of course, by virtue of that, dependent arising. So there are about, 6 verses for this? Verse 20. Nagarjuna says, if all of this is not empty, neither origination nor disintegration, then it follows for you that the Four Noble Truths do not exist. Notice how this verse mirrors what we saw in the very first verse that I read earlier from chapter 24. I'll read that one now, and you can compare it to what's going on the screen in front of you. If all of this is empty, neither arising nor disintegrating, then for you it follows that the Four Noble Truths do not exist. So the last 2 lines, and even the second line, are kind of, the same, but the first line is totally different, right? If all of this is empty, was the accusation that the opponent made, then none of this exists, the Four Noble Truths and so on. But so in Nagarjuna now, he's going back to the opponent and he's saying, but if all of this is not empty, with no inherent origination nor inherent disintegration, then it follows for you that the Four Noble Truths do not exist. So if you don't posit things as being empty, you're going to have the fault. Not us. Madhyamikas don't have the fault. The fault lies with those who are not in line with the middle way view. So let's see what Tsongkhapa says in this. It's a very short commentary for most of his verses that are from here on out. So I thought I would go ahead and put all of the commentary on screen. If all internal and external phenomena were not seen to be empty of essential existence, there would be neither becoming, arising, nor ceasing. Things would not come into existence. In that case, there would be, as according to your view, no Four Noble Truths. Why is that? Yes, this is Je Tsongkhapa again explaining what Nagarjuna is doing in the first part of that, saying essentially, things wouldn't be able to come into existence if they didn't lack essential existence. Because what we mean by essential or intrinsic independent existence is that things are existing on their own. They don't have any other factors. Therefore, they wouldn't arise. They wouldn't come into existence. They wouldn't become. Things would be inherently established and therefore not have any relationship process with any other thing. So why is that? The question is answered with the next verse, verse 21. If things are not dependent originations, how does suffering come to be? Suffering has been taught to be impermanent, so how can it exist from its intrinsic nature? So this is, again, in regard to what Tsongkhapa is going to, or Nagarjuna and then Tsongkhapa in explaining it, he's going to go through each of the Four Noble Truths, because he was essentially saying to this person who has been debating with Nagarjuna that if you don't adhere to emptiness, then none of the Four Noble Truths can be upheld. And this is the first one, the truth of suffering. So he's saying here, if things aren't dependent originations, and therefore, of course, aren't empty of inherent existence, how could suffering ever come to be? Suffering has been taught to be impermanent. It is in the nature of impermanence, right? Otherwise, we couldn't remove suffering, because suffering would never change. If it was intrinsically existent, it would be fixed. It would be unchanging. So how can it possibly exist from its own intrinsic nature? It's essentially independently, because suffering is impermanent. Suffering is a changing phenomenon. So Tsongkhapa, in commenting on that, as that which is essentially existent is not inherently arisen. Again, these two things that are opposing. The view of things having an essential or intrinsic existence is contradicted by them being dependently arisen. So if something is not dependently arisen, because it is essentially existent, it is not impermanent, just like a sky flower. I mean, a sky flower is often used as an example of a non-existent. You see a flower grow in the sky rather than from dirt or water or whatever ways. I guess they grow flowers hydroponically, but so far I don't think they've gotten them to grow in air. So a sky flower means it's not existent. So if you had something like a cup again, that cup is, if we say that it's essentially existent, therefore it can't be dependently arising. Therefore, it can't be impermanent. It can't be changing, because it is unchanging. So such a thing would not exist. Such a thing would be impossible to uphold. And even the lower schools would say that. They would say, well, if something can't exist as a changing phenomenon, then it can't exist at all, like a cup and so on. So it would be like a sky flower in that way. So in the light of that if things did lack essential existence, then they couldn't be impermanent, they couldn't be changing. So how could there be the truth of suffering? Tsongkhapa says, after all, as the Transcendent Lord has said, only impermanent things are suffering. Of course, not all impermanent things are suffering, but the idea is that it is in the nature of the truth of suffering that those things are impermanent, that the causes of our suffering are impermanent, and so on. But especially when we look at suffering itself, it's a changing phenomenon, changes moment by moment in terms of our own experience. Therefore, it has to be a dependently arisen phenomenon. Therefore, it has to be lacking essential existence. So if one maintained, Tsongkhapa says, that said that it is contaminated impermanent phenomena that are suffering, these phenomena exist essentially. So just like what these lower schools will do, they say, well, yes, they are impermanent, but they exist essentially. That is, in virtue of their essence. Then since those things do not have this nature, it would make no sense for them to be suffering. Because things would lack any ability to stand on their own. It would make no sense for them to be suffering if they existed essentially, because again, into lots of contradictions with regard to this. Contaminated impermanent phenomena, by virtue of saying they're impermanent and caused by contamination of the ignorance of inherent existence, or ignorance of reality, that is the clinging to inherent existence, that is what it causes suffering. That is what is behind suffering. That is the product of our suffering. So if one were still to hold that these phenomena exist essentially, then since things don't have that nature, it would make no sense for them to be suffering. They would lose their identity as that, in effect. Again, all these consequences are because you can't reconcile essential existence with dependent arising, and also therefore with impermanence, with change, as we've talked about on a number of occasions. If something were intrinsically, essentially existent, it would never change. So verse 22 kind of continues this whole logic and thinking. Verse 22 says, if things exist from their intrinsic nature, what then is the origin of suffering? This is the second noble truth, right? The origin or the causes of suffering. Therefore, for he who objects to emptiness, there is no origin of suffering. Because if things had their intrinsic nature, they wouldn't need an origin. They wouldn't need causes and conditions. They would already have that nature. Suffering would have the nature of suffering without depending upon any causes and conditions. You wouldn't need the second noble truth. If you object to emptiness, there is no origin of suffering. So Tsongkhapa again has a fairly short explanation for this one too. He says, if suffering existed essentially, it would not arise. It doesn't arise from causes and conditions then. It's already sort of intrinsically existing as suffering. Then how could it arise from the sources of suffering? It could not. It wouldn't be able to arise from them in the least. Thus, for those who criticize the view that suffering is empty of essence, those on the opponent right back at the beginning, who criticizes the view that it's empty of essence, that it lacks any essential existence, for them, the sources of suffering could not exist. If they are thinking that things, don't lack essential existence, then they can't depend upon any factors, because lacking essential existence and being a dependent arising are complementary. Having essential existence and having an independent way of arising, which would be kind of ridiculous to talk about, would be the way that you'd have to reconcile that. And no such thing happens. So the sources of suffering could not exist. Because suffering would be existing on its own. It's, having its essential existence. For they are called the sources of suffering because suffering arises from them. That's not what the Buddha gave that second noble truth, called them the origin, the sources of suffering, because suffering arises from them. So the Buddha was already spelling out in the Four Noble Truths the meaning of dependent arising, by saying from these causes of suffering, our karma, our delusions, especially the root of affliction, suffering arises, dukkha arises. So the Buddha was embracing the concept of dependent arising, and by virtue of that, embracing emptiness. So the 23rd verse, which is still in this first section again of this 6 parts, if suffering existed inherently, there would be no cessation, the third noble truth. Since intrinsic nature abides, one undermines true cessation. Because this is the idea that, once more, if a cessation or the intrinsic nature of suffering was there inherently, from its own side, fully established, it's going to continue to abide. And you could never have a cessation to it then, because it would be eternal. Our suffering would never go out of existence. We would always be in this state. Cessation would be impossible. So Tsongkhapa then says, if suffering existed essentially, intrinsically, independently, again, we can always include those meanings of this word whenever it's used in their translation here. If suffering existed essentially, there could not be the noble truth of the cessation of suffering, because with such an essence, it would not be changeable at all. Our cessation would be completely fixed. if it had an inherent essence, we would never be able to be free from it. Therefore, since if anything existed essentially, it would be eternal, those who attack the proponents of emptiness by maintaining the position that things exist essentially attack the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. Once more, this is Tsongkhapa throwing and Nagarjuna throwing that fault back on the opponent who is attacking the proponents of this view of emptiness, the madhyamikas, who are saying that things don't exist essentially. And so by them, attacking that and saying things do exist essentially, they've negated the cessation of suffering, because suffering would be eternal. Suffering would exist forever. Finally, the fourth noble truth. If the path possessed inherent existence, cultivation would become impossible, right? You wouldn't need to cultivate anything because that's how you create the causes and conditions for the path to arise. Since the path is indeed cultivated, contrary to that, it must not have your intrinsic nature. This is again what we are all engaged in studying Buddhism, is creating a path, creating a change in our minds on the basis of adopting these teachings and moving in the direction of the Dharma. That's what we mean by following the path, by finding the true path that eventually will lead to cessation by virtue of the direct realization of emptiness and so on. So this would all be impossible if things had inherent existence. So Tsongkhapa, in commenting on Nagarjuna's verse, says, if the truth of the path existed essentially, since it would exist without being practiced, in other words, it wouldn't need any causes, so you don't have to practice the path, it would exist already, it would not be tenable that it is practiced, because it can exist independent of that. It has independent, intrinsic, essential existence. So what would the point be of practicing it? Everything that the Buddha taught, all the 45 years he spent elaborating on the path to enlightenment and to liberation and so on, would be useless. The path itself, if it inherently existed, it would be here without requiring any causes and conditions. It would be a completely independent phenomenon. If one maintains that the truth of the path is something one must practice, so if you opponents, if you actually say it is something you still have to practice, well, then your noble path could not exist essentially, because it would require action. It requires change. It requires doing something. It requires movement. It requires all the things that essential existence would negate. So this is, again, this whole idea of these four noble truths each being set out. There's one more verse that kind of wraps this all up for this very first part. Nagarjuna says, now, if suffering, its origin, and cessation are non-existent, by what path can one seek the attainment of the cessation of suffering? So, he's once more going back to the opponents and saying, I've just shown you how each of these, the first noble truth, the second noble truth, the third noble truth, even the fourth noble truth, none of these can exist. They can't possibly exist under your logic of saying that they essentially exist. Well, then what path do you have by virtue of which you can attain the cessation of suffering and follow the Buddha's advice in achieving that goal? So Tsongkhapa, in commenting on that, says the path is in order to attain the cessation of suffering and to abandon the sources of suffering. But according to those who maintain that things exist essentially, there could be no source of suffering aggregates or truth of the cessation of suffering, or even the truth of the suffering itself. That wouldn't exist. None of these exist if they hold to essential existence, just as Tsongkhapa and Nagarjuna have already proven. So, without truth of the cessation of suffering that one aspires to obtain, and which is achieved by practicing the path, which one abandons its sources, it is not tenable that the path is practiced. In other words, he's Nagarjuna and of course Tsongkhapa, in commenting on this, have basically put the nail in the coffin on the view of essential existence, because he's pointing out that if you do hold to essential existence and say suffering exists essentially, the sources of that exist essentially, the cessation of that exists essentially, the path that leads to that cessation exists essentially, you've created a conundrum. You can't possibly reconcile these. They are all being established as inherently, intrinsically, independently existing. Therefore, you don't even have any of the relationship that the Buddha taught in regard to these four noble truths. That suffering arises on the basis of its sources, its causes, that the cessation will arise on the basis of practicing the path that leads to that, in overcoming the sources of our suffering, and by virtue of that, the suffering itself. All of what the Buddha teaches in the middle way perspective is tenable. All of what the opponents hold in terms of essential existence and things needing that intrinsic existence to exist is untenable. So again, we're getting kind of them being hammered again and again on the same point. But I think it is, quite important that we go through each of these, because we're now going to go on to some other things. Again, as I said, there are 5 more outlines within this that show that the opponent is actually the faulty one, and that all these other things wouldn't exist if essential existence did exist, which again, it could never exist. Let's go back to the slides for just a little bit more then, see if I can get through one more section. This is once more within this section on those who do not accept this. They can't have an ontological framework that's tenable. The second outline is knowledge of such things as the Four Noble Truths and the Four Fruits will make no sense. Recall that with the Four Noble Truths, we talk about them. The Buddha in his very first sutra said, the truth of suffering is to be known. The truth of the origin of suffering is to be abandoned. The truth of the cessation of suffering is to be actualized. The truth of the path that leads to cessation is to be cultivated. So we talked about how these actions need to be engaged in regard to the Four Noble Truths. Well, they're untenable. They will make no sense if there's essential existence, nor will the Four Fruits. The Four Fruits being the fruit of the attainer of stream enterer, the fruit of once returner, the fruit of non-returner, and the fruit of a foe destroyer. But anyway, we'll see this as we go through these verses. So if non-knowledge comes to be through its intrinsic nature, how can knowledge arise? Does not intrinsic nature abide? So this is the idea that, if we are in a state now where we don't know true sufferings, we don't have the knowledge of those and so on, and that exists intrinsically, then how could we ever have knowledge arise? Because we would always be in a state of non-knowing. We would always be in a state of ignorance. And he's saying there, then how can intrinsic nature abide? Does not it abide? I mean, it can't possibly abide in the face of that. So Tsongkhapa, in commenting on that verse, says, if suffering exists earlier as essentially not completely understood, so if we haven't completely understood suffering earlier on, which is where most beings are at, right? And it exists essentially, their non-knowledge exists essentially. How will it come to be completely understood later? How can we ever generate the knowledge of suffering if our lack of knowledge, our non-knowledge exists intrinsically, essentially? Again, this is pointing once more to that idea that if things did exist essentially, they would be fixed, they would be unchanging. They would be completely identified as that from their own side and be incapable of being transformed from our non-knowledge, our ignorance, to the state of wisdom. So the next part, he says, does that which exists essentially, like the heat of fire, not endure in exactly the same form? It does, because existentially and changing something else are inconsistent. So again, the idea here is that if things did have an intrinsic existence, they would exist, in an enduring way, an unchanging way, in exactly the same form. So, existing essentially and changing into something else are inconsistent. You can't reconcile those two. Of course, the opponent, right back at the beginning, said your lack of existing essentially and changing into something are contradictory. But that's not how it is. It's actually the opposite. Things existing essentially and changing into something else are what's inconsistent and cannot be upheld within the sphere of our analysis. So then a second verse in this section around the knowledge of the Four Truths, it says, similarly, just as with knowledge, which was with regard to the truth of suffering, we are again to know the truth of suffering. Your relinquishment, which is in regard to the sources of suffering, the second noble truth. Remember I said that the sources of suffering are to be abandoned, to be relinquished. Third, the truth of cessation is to be actualized, so their actualization. The fourth noble truth, the truth of the path, is to be cultivated. So here he's saying their cultivation. And the four fruits, again, those beings who attain realizations, a stream enter, and so on, these will all become untenable. So again, the knowledge of the truth of suffering, the relinquishment of the truth of the origin of suffering, the actualization of the true cessation of suffering, the cultivation of the true path that leads to the cessation of suffering, and all the fruits that are attained on the basis of that, these will become untenable. Again, this harkens back to where the opponent refuted these things. They essentially said, none of these things could exist if you have emptiness of inherent existence. But once more, Nagarjuna is throwing the argument back at the opponent and saying, if um, uh, emptiness doesn't exist and you adhere to things as being essentially existent, then none of these things make any sense with regard to the Four Noble Truths or the four fruits or whatever the case might be. Just as complete understanding would be impossible according to your view, the abandonment of the sources of suffering, the realization of cessation, and the practice of the path would all be impossible. So again, that was what I was just saying in regard to those three actions that we do in regard to the other three truths. Having looked at understanding or knowing suffering, you also could never abandon the sources of suffering, realize the cessation of suffering, practice the path that leads to that. All of those would be impossible. This is because if the sources of suffering already existed essentially as unabandoned, they could not be abandoned later because essence cannot change. So if, we'd use the example that the sources of suffering were already existing essentially as unabandoned, which is where we're at now, and we haven't abandoned our suffering, but it doesn't exist essentially, or else we could never change that. Essence cannot change. We couldn't abandon our sources of suffering later. So this is the one that he points to as the example that if we take the sources of our suffering and if we say that we haven't abandoned them yet, and that has essential existence, then there's no way we could ever abandon them. The essence of something can't change if that's what you mean, when you cling to essential existence. So he says these refutations presented in the context of complete understanding should be applied as they have just been explained to the other two claims. So we saw it in regard to the knowledge or the understanding of suffering, the abandonment of the sources of suffering. So you should apply the same logic to looking at the realization or actualization of the path. The actualization of the cessation, as well as the realization, the cultivation of the path. Final verse in this, and then we'll take a little break and see where things are at before we conclude tonight. For you who uphold intrinsic nature, the fruits would already be realized through their intrinsic nature. So in what way can they be attained? Because if these exist, they exist intrinsically. They always have existed. There's no point in attaining them. Of course, if our non-attainment of them existed intrinsically, we would never be able to attain them. Just like complete understanding, what we saw in the second previous verse, if the four fruits, such as the fruit of the stream enterer, did not exist previously, it would not be possible for them to exist later. This is once more hearkening back to that idea that the only way you can get the Buddhist system to make any sense of, and I mean, this is again within the whole worldly view as well, the only way for things to actually be able to change is for them to lack inherent existence, for them to not be essentially existing. So if you hold to the contrary, then everything else becomes untenable. Nothing is possible. How could four fruits that existed earlier as essentially attained later? They could not be, because being completely essentialized, their nature could not change. Again, same thing I've been saying again and again. So we're going to go on possibly in a few minutes, depending on what questions or comments people have, but otherwise the next time we'll continue this. So were there any questions that people wanted to raise in terms of, and you're welcome to unmute your mic if you'd like to ask a question, but if you want to put a comment in the chat box, that's perfectly fine too. So I don't know. Doesn't look like anyone's asking any questions. So if you do decide to add something to the chat box, by all means, feel free to do that. But I'm hoping everyone's getting this. I mean, it does seem like we're hammering this point home a little, repeatedly. But keep in mind, in Nagarjuna's text, there's a lot of that repetition. We only study these 3 chapters, but in the whole first part of it, he continues to go through various things and say, agents and actions don't exist intrinsically, and time doesn't exist intrinsically, and space doesn't exist intrinsically, and kind of refutes all these various phenomena because we still kind of keep holding on to things. We have to get many different phenomena that we refute and understand the ways of refuting them. So there's one question: what are the 4 fruits? Again, these are taught. There's actually a whole section in one of the texts that we studied in the master's program called "The Ornament for Clear Realizations" by Maitreya. He talks about within the 4 fruits, we can talk about the attainment of those as being the final fruit. We have the fruit of stream enter. A stream enter is a being who hasn't done a lot of deeper work in terms of developing some of the concentrations that help one to separate to some degree from the manifest afflictions of various levels. This gets real complicated to explain the entire process. But you have stream enters who simply have attained the direct, simply is quite an achievement, but all that they've attained in terms of their own mental development is the direct realization of emptiness. And on that path of seeing, when they realize that, they become a stream enter. Well, there are some people when they enter the path of seeing who become a once returner. A once returner is a being who will go on to actually one more lifetime before they attain enlightenment. And that's on the basis of some of these deeper concentration states that they've attained. The non-returner, on the basis too of that deeper work, when they enter the path of seeing, they've actually accomplished a state where they will not return to existence for another life. They will attain the state of foe destroyer in that lifetime in which they attain the path of seeing. And then finally, you have the foe destroyer, which are the final fruit of all these different practitioners who actually are, when they've completely abandoned the afflictions. So this is really, they usually use these demarcations of stream enter, once returner, non-returner, and foe destroyer in relation to the Hinayana path, the path of the individual vehicle, because they're spelling out how one actually goes about abandoning the afflictions. And the big differentiation, again, between the first 3 at least, is whether or not one has developed these deeper states of concentration, what are called the 4 concentrations and the 4 formless absorptions, as to whether or not they've begun the process of separating from those afflictions at a coarser level so that they can eventually achieve a much quicker freedom from them at a subtler level. And so they're taught in a number of different texts, but that's essentially, again, a way that the Buddha talked about how different practitioners might go about achieving the 4th fruit, the state of foe destroyer, is by virtue of how they practice these different states of concentration along the path. And by virtue of that, what power they have to remove more quickly or less quickly the afflictive obscurations that keep them in samsara. So maybe one of these days I can teach on that, but it's a very complex topic. In the Ornament for Clear Realization, the topic is called the 20 Sangha, which refer to kind of 20 different iterations with regard to those 4. Because even within the 4, you can already see that there are 4 that are approachers to that are kind of beings that are getting close to attaining those various states versus beings who are actually abiding in those. So you have kind of 8 Sangha that are delineated there, and then you have, different iterations on all of those. It's a very complex topic. I remember getting extremely lost in it when I was at the master's program, because this was in our very first course when so many of us were really green in terms of our understanding of Buddhism, and it just was like, whew, right over my head. So, but that essentially is what these 4 fruits are. The main fruit, the final one, being the state of foe destroyer, but stream enter, once returner, non-returner being different approaches or ways of coming up to eventually achieving that result. Foe destroyer being, again, a being who has completely abandoned the foe, that is the afflictive obscurations. That's all on the Hinayana path. The Bodhisattva also will abandon the afflictive obscurations, but their main target is the knowledge obscurations, the obscurations to omniscience, which once more aren't the afflictions, they're the residue left from the afflictions, especially the ignorance that has clung to inherent existence since beginningless time, that has that stain. Again, the analogy that's used is it's like a clay pot that's been used to store garlic. removing the garlic is like removing the afflictive obscurations, but then you smell the pot and it still has the stain of that. So these are very subtle imprints in our minds that the bodhisattva is intent upon being free of, but on their path, they still have to do all the work to achieve the complete abandonment of the afflictive obscurations. Sometime when it seems appropriate, if you could integrate the 6 perfections practices and the practice to obtain the wisdom realizing emptiness. Thanks. I'm actually teaching on the 6 perfections on Sunday, if you want to link into that and hear a bit about the 6 perfections. But certainly there are some within the 6 perfections that are more about kind of method versus wisdom. But keep in mind that these two, wings of a bird, are used in tandem. That even for us to just focus on wisdom without the merit making and method of compassion and so on that's embodied in the other perfections would be kind of crazy. But all of those without the wisdom is also a little crazy. So they often say that these are like 5 blind people that need the eyes of wisdom in order to get to the result. But nonetheless, if we only have the eyes of wisdom and we don't have any kind of mode of getting there, that's not going to be so helpful. But yeah, so that was a good question too. And maybe at some point I can talk a little bit more about that. But on Sundays, we're going through each of the perfections and talking about them. I don't know that I'll finish them all before I go on the road. If I go on the road, who knows what's happening? We're in this state of uncertainty. Maybe before we close tonight, I will talk a little bit about kind of how to work with our times. I mentioned at the Sunday class, some of you may have been at that we're using this term social distancing, which I don't like that term because we can still be socially close. It's just not physically close. And I really think it's important that people continue to have these means of, being with each other, having connection, especially for each of us to maybe pay attention to those who come to our center or who are in our lives who are living alone, to make sure that they don't feel even more isolated potentially by this. So there are lots of ways to connect. We can connect through social media, connect through online teachings like this. We can connect by just picking up the phone. But there are many ways to connect without having to have the physical closeness. So I really want to encourage people to take advantage of what we do have. We've got lots of technology now that can help us to be still quite connected to each other, even in this time where we're dealing with these challenges. So again, to get to the Sunday teachings on the 6 perfections or any of the other teachings that we're doing at Thupten Norberling, go to our webpage, the tnlsf.org, and on the very front page, there should be on that kind of marquee or whatever on the one side, there should be a link that you can click on to each of those different, again, we're doing Wednesday night that we're doing right now, Saturday morning and Sunday morning. And once you click on those, you can go to another page where you can actually get into streaming the teaching. And again, it'll indicate what time that is, keeping in mind those are all mountain daylight time out there right now. So. And then in terms of what else was I going to talk about in terms of what we're going through? I do think that I've been posting some things on Facebook around needing to practice Tonglen during this time, or encouraging people to practice Tonglen. As we know, Tonglen is one of the most powerful ways to keep our hearts open in the midst of all this. You can see what's going on in the world and people almost kind of closing up to some degree. Some people are opening up, which is always wonderful to see, right? We feel very inspired when people are being very courageous and doing things for others that are really quite noble. But nonetheless, we all have to watch that tendency, and we can break through some of that simply by doing Tonglen, simply by sitting with the suffering that we witness in the world around us, by even looking at our own anxiety and stress, and certainly acknowledging that other people probably are dealing with similar things, that we can breathe that in, take that in, and let it annihilate that tendency that we have to be self-centered. And then breathe out, give them all of what we have so that they can experience some peace, some calm, some satisfaction in the midst of this crazy stuff that we're going through in this world. So I don't know, there's lots of things, lots of advice, and maybe each week I'll try to give a little bit different advice, but I really like Tonglen as a practice, and I think that it's an important part of keeping our hearts open during this time, and even expanding them, making them much wider so that we don't close ourselves off to what's going on in the world around us. So Maybe that's enough. I'm not feeling like my voice is getting hoarse anyway. So we're at about 8:10 or so, which I think is perfect time to just wrap things up with a few prayers. So let me go ahead and share once more the prayer sheet that Chris had put together. I didn't get a chance to edit it before, so we did have one little change there, but um, these are the closing prayers we generally do center. On page 235 of the prayer book, these two prayers that have been kind of lumped together here into this verse. Let's recite that together, keeping in mind that what we've done here tonight with bodhicitta motivation, with this desire to be a benefit to all beings, can become a cause for that result. And we want to make sure that it's protected, that it actually does bring forth the result of our own enlightenment, so we can then lead all beings to attaining that same state of Buddhahood. And then also that second part of it, where we recall bodhicitta and how important it is that we continue to cultivate and develop that mind in the midst of whatever it is that we're experiencing. To have that open heart that is having an altruistic intention to benefit all beings. So let's read these two verses together with those thoughts in mind. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. So again, I had changed this on her file to the new prayer for His Holiness that Rinpoche advised that we do, and we'll also do the prayer for Lama Zopa. As we recite these verses for these two teachers, extend this out with a heartfelt wish that all gurus, all spiritual guides, whatever tradition they are in this world, if they are helping others to lead a more moral life, to lead a more productive, compassionate life in this world, then may they have good health, may they have long lives, and may we and others always have perfect guides in all our lifetimes. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers, honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Then finally, we can dedicate for anyone that we're holding in our hearts, people that we know, or even again, individuals, groups that are being affected in the world by illness, by obstacles, climate change, harm from the elements, what have you. We can think about those that we know who are experiencing some sickness or dying or who have died. All those beings that we're holding in our hearts right now, make strong dedications for their welfare. Send this positive energy that we've created here tonight out to them, and think that it becomes the causes for them to be free from their suffering and to have all that they need to find true happiness. And may all beings find true peace and happiness through what we've done here tonight. Okay, thank you all so much. I really appreciate everyone being here, and I'll be on again next Wednesday for this class on fundamental wisdom, and look forward to seeing you then. Take care, stay safe and healthy. Be well.